Yeah, let's start.
What's the order?
Bob, Kevin, Mac. Nice try. All right, let's go ahead and start. Yep. We're all set. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Daniel Fabricant, Natural Products Association. Thanks for joining us today. As always, we wanted to come out bright and early when there's something new on the horizon. And last Friday, Congress passed the Moor Act. The House did. While it hasn't been scheduled yet in the Senate, we want to discuss what it possibly meant for your business, as well as what it means going forward. The 117th Congress, states, and what's really going to happen as it pertains to banking on cannabis and hemp. So we're really lucky to be joined by three wonderful panelists today, great speakers. After I give my little spiel and intro, we've got Bob Hoban. If you're familiar at all with the cannabis hemp world, you know the name Bob Hoban. He's been a really preeminent attorney in the space for decades and knows from states to international law. I think Bob's actually leaving tomorrow to get on a plane to work with some foreign governments on some hemp implementation rules. So when it comes to the legal side of international rules and regs, Bob's the guy to know. After Bob will be Kevin Bell. Kevin's our outside attorney, and Kevin knows all things IP as well as the state rules and regs and roads to go as it pertains to the hemp cannabis space. Kevin's been our counsel for almost 10 years here at NPA, and we're very grateful always to have his influence and his input here. And last but certainly not least is a man who needs no introduction, Mac Haddow of Upstream Consulting. Mac has been involved with government at every level, from his time at HHS to running different campaigns, both sides of the House, both Republican and Democrat. Everyone knows Mac in the healthcare space, and he's done some wonderful things, and we're real happy to have him here on this. So we'll dive in real quick with just a little bit of housekeeping up front. So first and foremost, we had a busy year here in 2020. NPA kept businesses open with assisted DHS guidelines, which was a big thing. Really worked with retailers in the supply chain to make sure that was covered. We got a bill drop for HSA expansion. Certainly continued to work on trying to get CBD, as everybody, all the panelists did, to get CBD implemented and get some real muscle behind that and have it moved ahead with Congress. It doesn't appear that that's going to happen this Congress, but again, happy to see the Moor Act is out. I know everyone here was pushing some derivative of that to make sure people can safely bank. And NPA has been involved certainly to make sure quality standards are there on SSCI. SSCI audits will be up soon, so go to our site, ssciglobal.org, and check that out. It's a great thing. Like the food industry has GFSI, we're going to have SSCI for the dietary supplement industry soon. Next slide. So the Moor Act, Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment Expungement Act, really removes the criminality of doing any banking on marijuana, different transactions, and our speakers are going to dive in more to the details, but makes SBA loans and services available for cannabis-related businesses, and then prohibits the denial of federal benefits to a person on certain cannabis-related issues. So it's really important in terms of accessing capital markets, banking for all sizes of business, not just small, large, what have you, but really ensuring that we have a clear path to banking as it pertains to hemp cannabis businesses, which is important, especially for the folks looking to get involved in CBD, which is banking is certainly difficult to say the least, but I'm going to leave it to our panel to get into the details there. Next slide. Now, it just passed the House. It has not passed the Senate, and it's unlikely the Senate will take it up. But you still have the states in play. You have 15 states in D.C. have fully legalized cannabis. 10 states have legalized medicinal cannabis and decriminalized recreational. So you've got 19 states with specific laws to allow retailers to sell hemp-derived products. So how do folks do their transactions? How do they bank? And a lot of those state laws, some folks have theorized, would interfere with the federal law. So there has to be at some point a release valve, and that's essentially what the Moor Act would do, would provide that release valve. Next slide. So, and like we said, not many days left in the 116th Congress, unlikely to pass Republican-led Senate. There is more House Republican support. The bill passed with 5 Republicans voting in favor of the bill. Depending on the term of the election, we know the Electoral College meets today. Vice President Harris, she is the sponsor of the Senate version, co-sponsor. Current passage really sends a very strong message, and there's a lot of implications, and that's really what our panel is going to talk about, is what's the regulatory pathway, what does it mean in terms of doing transactions for the regulatory pathway, and what are the hurdles, both regulatory-wise, state-wise, for dietary ingredients and food additives. Moving ahead. Next slide. So if you have any questions, and you should be an NPA member already if you're not, but you can certainly reach out to our membership folks. Felix's email is below, and we'll be following up with all of you about NPA. We like to be first out on these topics. It's important to get good information out before really nature affords a vacuum. So we want to make sure we get the story right, and that's really why I'm going to turn it over now to the experts. We'll start out with Bob Hoban. Bob, take us away.
Well, good morning, Dan, Kyle. Thanks to you and thanks to the NPA for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with Mac and with Kevin. The Moor Act, obviously, Moor is the word stands for Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment Expungement Act, and that language is telling because this is primarily a social justice measure. Now, it has implications ultimately if it were to be passed, although I'm sure we'll get into the likelihood of it coming out of our U.S. Senate, which is nil in its present iteration. But we'll talk a little bit about that. It sets the table for the discussion and the policy evolution. But as a social justice measure, it really seeks to impact criminal justice reform. It seeks to gather data and look towards expungement and trying to exact some measure of justice, as we've seen the criminalization of cannabis beginning in the teens, ultimately into the 1930s with something called the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which is what effectively put the line in the sand of prohibiting the use of marijuana and, interestingly enough, industrial hemp. And for those of you online today, this may be obvious, but let me state a fact, and that is the cannabis plant, of course, is something that has been subject to UN treaty treatment since the 1961 UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs. It defined cannabis, and then the signatory nations, such as the United States, had to take measures to enact laws under that 1961 convention to go ahead and implement regulations, schedules, and controls. So marijuana, with an H, marijuana, was defined under our 1970s Controlled Substances Act, which tracked the language from the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. So beginning with the CSA in the 1970s, you had marijuana scheduled as a Schedule I drug, meaning high potential for abuse and no medicinal benefit. It's been treated as such since that time. Now, we have seen recent movement in weeks, not just the passage of the Moor Act from the House of Representatives, but we did see recommendations come out of the United Nations Committee on Narcotic Drugs in the last 2 weeks with U.S. approval that would reclassify cannabis as a lower priority, lower scheduled drug. How that ultimately shakes out in terms of regulatory implementation across the states remains to be seen. But this does represent a movement towards differential treatment of cannabis. Of course, in the United States, when I talk about cannabis, I view the cannabis plant as having an industry of two sides. You've got the industrial hemp side of the industry and the marijuana side of the industry. Now, the Moor Act effectively creates a blurring of the lines between the two. Technically, as a legal matter, the distinction between hemp and marijuana is the THC content by plant, by dry weight. 0.3% THC by dry weight. If it's 0.3 or above, it is a marijuana plant and subject to criminal and other controls. If it's below 0.3%, then it is treated as industrial hemp so long as that's grown consistently in the United States within the confines of a state-approved program. So the Moor Act effectively eliminates that distinction. It not just treats cannabis or marijuana differently, but it looks to deschedule the plant, remove it from the schedules, which is a pretty significant step. But as I mentioned, it is more of a social justice measure along the backdrop of everything else I just mentioned than a commercial or regulatory program. It does not create a federal licensing entity. It does not create a federal regulatory framework. States could, however, if this were to pass and be signed by our next president, if that were to occur, it could create the baseline for states to continue to enact programs as they've done, and then those programs would have to comply with some sort of federal mandate, federal standard, which we have not seen occur yet. Now, even if this were to occur, even if the Moor Act were to pass, there's still going to be a number of challenges. Now, one of the things that I was looking at is in the hemp industry and most of the activities surrounding what I'd call non-intoxicating cannabinoids, such as CBD as an ingredient in the marketplace, much of that activity has taken place in the absence of regulation. Some of the states, Colorado being the first with the passage of our Hemp Foods Act, which sought to and does treat derivatives from the hemp plant as a food or a supplement. Most of the activity from a regulatory perspective has happened at the state level. The FDA has not come out with concrete permanent regs, nor has it come out with concrete guidance in the meantime for enforcement, although it is our understanding that such a memo does exist in the executive branch or perhaps in the White House. We just haven't seen it. So the states have filled the void. Now, what we've seen on the hemp side of the industry with CBD, et cetera, is that in the absence of uniform regulation, we've seen smaller players across the board, hundreds, if not thousands of smaller players. If this Moor Act were to pass, it would signal to, for lack of a better way to put it, the big boys, institutional parties, Fortune 500 companies, et cetera, that this is an area that they can play in without reservation because it has been removed from the criminal ranks and the Controlled Substances Act at the federal level. If that were to occur, then we'd see a major shakeup of the existing cannabinoid extract marketplace because those smaller players would in all likelihood be replaced by larger players who control shelf space already in distribution outlets. And certainly they have their supply chains, their distribution and manufacturing facilities already in place. So that would create a major shakeup. And the passage of the Moor Act, if it were to come out of the Senate, although as I mentioned again to stress, not likely in its current iteration, then we're going to have a scenario where a lot of the existing players would be put on the outside. Some of the other potential impacts of the Moor Act include the fact that even hemp derivative companies, CBD producers, for example, even though in 2018, when the president signed the Farm Bill, which made conclusive that hemp and hemp plants and derivatives should be removed from the Controlled Substances Act, including, as a notable thing, THC as a derivative. And that's an interesting thing. In May of 2019, the USDA put out a memorandum that indicated that even THC, as aggregated from an industrial hemp plant, is no longer a controlled substance. Now, we haven't seen a lot of activity on that, but that's why we continue to see the DEA with their oversight and their controls over what comes out of the industrial hemp plant and the cannabis plant as a whole. But the CBD companies have had difficulty with access to banking, whether that's merchant services or simple depository accounts, because of the confusion. In the Moor Act, if it were to pass, would help eliminate those banking challenges. It would help eliminate advertising and marketing challenges. We've seen CBD companies, for example, have extreme difficulty marketing their products, whether that's digitally or through more mainstream related sources. So at the end of the day, there are a number of things that would happen in a positive way as it affects the CBD industry, for lack of a better way to put it, or the CBD ingredient industry. But we haven't seen those things happen because there has been no uniform policy. Now, that's the upshot for the hemp side of the industry. The downside, perhaps, is it eliminates that distinction between marijuana and hemp. And hemp has been a place where we have seen a lot of activity. After all, it is presently legal in the United States, although we haven't seen, as I mentioned, the regulatory oversight and regulatory requirements surrounding those derivatives, which would give consumers confidence and policymakers comfort that the products in the marketplace were what they said they are, that they're safe and consistent, and that's certainly a goal of the NPA, of myself and so many actors in this space. Now, the passage of the Moor Act would further help to eliminate or at least mitigate the stigma attached to the cannabis plant, because if it were to become legal, what we've seen happen all around the world, particularly during these COVID days, we've seen hemp and marijuana legislation reform passed all over the world as primarily an economic driver. We've seen countries like Costa Rica, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, countries across the European Union and beyond that have in the last 9 months legalized some form of cannabis for commercial use because they saw it as a job creator, as an economic driver. Now, the United States, of course, has stayed out of most of that except for the hemp industry, and that exists without regulation right now. So at the end of the day, are these products safe? Are they consistent? What is the standard common denominator for product development, for regulation, and otherwise? Those are the things that are going to come, and the Moor Act would certainly put those things in the forefront moving forward. A couple of other items, and then I'll pass the baton over to Kevin, is when you look at this global cannabis industry, and you might watch this and you might say, but I'm a producer in the Midwest of natural products, and that includes CBD products. Why does the international marketplace matter? Well, the international marketplace matters because right now we're seeing tremendous growth, particularly over the last 9 months on a global scale. We've seen major policy changes on an international scale that would signal that there is a global cannabis economy. So even if you are a producer of products in a particular jurisdiction, distributing your products online or with some limited brick and mortar distribution, primarily for topicals, including cannabinoids, you need to understand that this product, this plant, does begin to move towards commoditization, meaning that the prices, the manner of production and distribution become standardized. And that hasn't occurred yet. And for those of us that have participated in the industry to date, it has been a mixed bag. Some business relationships are very good. Others are just the worst, most unprofessional scenarios you can possibly imagine, and that has created and increased the stigma around the industry and the plant. The Moor Act would take a step towards eliminating that stigma, towards signaling that this plant, within certain confines and controls and regulations, can be used for a variety of purposes, not the least of which would be for its derivatives as ingredients at a supplement and food level, let alone at an API pharmaceutical grade level. So we'll see all of those things happen anyway under the existing law, but the Moor Act would take steps towards waiving and introducing and welcoming large players that are sitting on the sidelines now saying, we're not going to move until there is federal legalization. And one piece of evidence surrounding that would seem to look at the Canadian marketplace. And while it's not a model marketplace, and Canada's regulations under Health Canada for the cannabis plant are not ideal from a business-friendly regulatory perspective, we did see, upon the passage of federal legalization in Canada, and let's not forget, Canada, while it is a country, it's not much bigger than the population of Canada, and its economy doesn't even compare to the Californian marketplace. But that market went through the roof. We saw billions and billions of dollars funneled into those public markets in Canada to fund and expand this industry because of legalization. So those are just some signals and some evidence of what would likely occur and what could occur if this were to pass. Now, the last thing I'll mention before I do pass it over is, remember, it's not likely to pass a Republican-led Senate because Mitch McConnell controls the Senate and the Senate calendar. And ultimately, while McConnell has been a champion for the industrial hemp plan, to wit is the 2018 Farm Bill, which had generated from his office and from his leadership in the state of Kentucky, he is not a friend of what he calls hemp's illicit cousin, the marijuana plant. And as long as the Republicans continue to control the Senate, it's not likely to come out of that. Now, as we look at the runoff elections in the state of Georgia, with 2 Senate seats up, if both of those Senate seats go one way to the Democrats, then you're looking at a majority. If it 1 and 1 gets split, then you're looking at a balance in the Senate, which would require our vice president to cast the deciding vote on issues like this. And we know where she stands on these issues. And ultimately, if the Republicans sweep the Georgia Senate race, then they would continue to maintain control of the Senate. And it's not likely that cannabis reform would therefore come out of our US Congress with approval from the US Senate. But it is interesting because it begins to move this debate forward, not about whether or not marijuana is a good thing, but whether it can be regulated and whether it can be controlled in a distributable format in a way that policymakers, consumers, and operators can all be controlled, and all of that material can be controlled and tracked so that we understand where it's going and and who's consuming it and how much is being produced. And those are things that the Moor Act would go towards. And the FDA's challenges would only increase more dramatically because the THC, the higher levels of THC and the derivatives from the marijuana side of the industry would then have to be controlled by the FDA as well. And presently, they're controlled at the state level by state government agencies that mimic the FDA's guidance, but are not equipped from a resources, human capital, or expertise perspective to adequately govern the production of higher THC-related materials. So we'll continue to see, even if the Moor Act was passed, some sort of regulation over high THC products, whether that comes from the federal government or whether that begins overseas and we adopt that model. Those are the things that remain to be seen, but the Moor Act is significant because it continues that debate. Kevin.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that. That was fantastic. Thanks to MPA for inviting me to participate in this as well. I'm over at MPA quite a bit as general counsel, but it's always enjoyable to participate in these. And maybe I'll do a little bit of plug, maybe for MPA on this, and that what you're hearing here today from Bob and Mac and myself, as well as Dan and Kyle, is that this issue, this industry is going to have to run through Washington, right? How these things become legalized, accepted, regulated is going to have to come through Washington, even as I start to talk about how this flows across states. And so what I would say is you do need to be joining an organization like MPA that's out there advocating, and more importantly, and I think both Bob and Mac would agree with this, is that you need to, MPA has a political action committee, a PAC that you should be contributing to as well, so you can kind of do this advocacy. People can go up there and it does move the needle. For those of us that are up on the Hill working in Washington, this is important stuff, and influence can occur, but you would be surprised at how many leaders in Congress, on the Senate and the House side, and I've been in offices of some very senior Senate leadership that don't know what this is really about, because as Bob said earlier, and I think Mac's going to put the nail in the coffin on it when I'm done, is that this is probably, the Moor Act is probably not going to get through the Senate. And so while it was certainly a symbolic victory in the House for many reasons that Bob said, you have people sitting on these committees over in the Senate side that need more education, and they need it from industry. So I would just encourage that as you listen to this, because as you're going to see, no matter what any of us say, it's going to come down to agencies and Congress and the White House. So one of the things I was going to talk about, you see the statistics up on the screen, the numbers, and on the legalization of cannabis, medical marijuana, and hemp, and how it flows to the states. And I think Mac is going to probably take you through a more federal level as to how the 117th Congress is going to treat a lot of these things. But I think to do that, you have to look at what happened or is happening in the 116th Congress and somewhat at the elections at the state level. And if you look at the passage on the Moor Act, you actually had something we don't hear very much of anymore, which is some form of bipartisanship. You had, I believe, 5, I think Republicans moved to what they call the Democratic side of the aisle to vote for this, and 6 Democrats, conservative Democrats, moved to the Republican side of the vote on this, and it still got through. So this is still somewhat of certainly a partisan debate, but there is bipartisanship, and you're seeing it in the House, and you're seeing it because you're seeing a lot more dedicated representation of districts within states. People have to run for re-election every 2 years, not every 6. And you're starting to see a movement here about what people in the United States care about when they're taking surveys. I saw a recent survey where there was a supermajority of Americans that approved this. I think 81% of the Democrats, about 64 to 9% of Republicans, and 70% of independents all were in favor of legalization of marijuana and the decriminalization of this, and expunging records. And expunging records, as Bob pointed out, it was very important. But this also has such broad impacts. I don't know of any I look at just cabinet positions, I don't have any cabinet position or industry that cannabis, CBDs are not going to impact it. It's going to permeate society. The horse is out of the barn on this. And so I think that the faster it gets addressed, the better. With respect to the states, you had certain seats flip in this election. I think the Republicans had a good election side on the House this term. States such as Georgia, New York, California, Iowa, Minnesota, many of those states also have current active legislation going on regarding cannabis and CBDs at the state level. And so you're starting to see, all right, how is this in the 117th Congress how's that going to be impacted based on the fact that there's state legislation going through, and each of these states have their own reason to want passage of this. Some social justice issues, decriminalization, some to help small businesses, some for taxes. Many and a lot of work that we're doing relates to the use of CBDs in products, which the acceptance rate is really high on that. The FDA has not come out with the rules and regulations guiding that, especially an acceptable daily intake amount, which is not helpful. I mean, as Bob said, Health Canada doesn't have a perfect system, and there's certainly flaws with it, but at least they've laid something out, and that's what the FDA needs to do. And there is a document over at Office of Management Budget that has something. I don't know if it's going to have anything earth-shattering for anybody. I know we'll all watch it, but I think it's an important thing to watch as you go through the various states and you have legislation out there. It's all different. Some want CBDs legalized, but they only want certain things. Others say it's okay in food. So because the FDA is not acting, but it has come off the Controlled Substance Act, the legalization and use for hemp-related CBD products, the states are taking this on themselves and coming up with their own laws. Now, who does that impact? Everybody, and I mean everybody from not just individuals, but banking laws, merchants, payment processing companies. If you look at what's happening right now, I recently spoke at a trade association event for electronic transaction companies, and they're very interested in getting more guidance. They've gotten some guidance from some of their regulators as best they can, but at the end of the day, the FDA is the one that is really kind of holding things back on this. And look, we certainly know the FDA has been looking at this for a while and was probably overwhelmed with this issue when all of a sudden CBDs just were everywhere, and so is the use of cannabis. But the states are taking things upon themselves, which is somewhat frustrating for financial institutions because of things like interstate commerce. How are you dealing with certain things about certain formulations, ingestibles, stuff like this? We do a lot of work in that area, and I'll tell you that it's frustrating as they prepare policies and procedures. And we assist with those things, how those play out and how they shift as it goes through state legislatures, where you have to pay attention to not just what's going on in the House and Senate, but also what's going on at the federal level, but also what's going on in those state legislatures. It's funny. I back in the early 90s worked for Dan Glickman, who was head of the Agricultural Committee and then became President Clinton's Secretary of Agriculture. And going back to Dan, I just saw something on Twitter from him recently talking about how cannabis has the ability to satisfy innate earnings for archaic boundary dissolution and yet leave intact the struggles of ordinary society. Legal cannabis has created over 200,000 full-time jobs in the United States. So this issue could not touch more things right now than most of the things we would normally be talking about on a webinar. And certainly when Bob's comments about the international aspect of it, people look at the United States as being behind the 8 ball on this. States find this a great revenue generator, job creator, but the companies that work within these states and have to work within these regulations, they want, I mean, for an industry that everyone believes, that many believers just running wild, they really don't want to run as wild as everyone thinks they do. They would actually like a framework for regulations around them. And so would all of the service providers to them, especially, like I said, financial institutions. So I think you're going to see, I think what you're going to see is that's going to continue. You have to almost watch the states on an almost daily basis. I think Governor Murphy up in New Jersey finally got to deal with his state legislature to move forward on some legislation, which I think they probably thought was going to happen years ago. So as you're looking at these changes on at the state levels, and then also as you look at, like, let's just use the House of Representatives as an example again, you know, an important thing to figure out is our committee chairmanships and going to be switching as we go along. What is going to be the agenda as you go through this for the state you're in, and for all the companies out there, no matter what industry you're in and who regulates you, you're being held up somewhat by the FDA. And so how do you monitor that? You have younger House Representatives probably now than ever before. And at the leadership levels, I think we're going to see a generational shift over the next 4 years. So I agree. I don't think the Moor Act goes any further than where it is right now over on the Senate side. In fact, I don't think it's even going to be put on the calendar. And I think Mitch McConnell said if he keeps his position as majority leader, you know, you won't really see it that early on in the 117th Congress. But at the state levels, when you have these things conflicting with federal law, that's where institutional providers to cannabis and CBD companies take a step back. And they say, what do we do here when, okay, I'm in Delaware or I'm in Oregon. Okay, they're not going to come bother me. But what about the guys with the windbreakers from the FDA and the FTC? Are they going to come and affect my business? Or am I going to violate or regulate a banking regulation? Because the Moor Act has a direct impact on another bill, a safe banking bill going through Congress, that it's got a direct impact on that as to how that goes forward. So you can't live in a world where we have 50 plus entities out there thinking different ways, and then the federal government saying we'll get back to you. So we really do need the FDA to come out with the way they're looking at the way they're going to look at things, or at least give more guidance. And we certainly want them to do that in a thoughtful way with respect to safety. But the sooner the better. So I think you're going to continue to see states take things into their own hands, whether it's medical marijuana, the legalization of marijuana, cannabis laws, medical cannabis, medical CBDs, the CBD industry, dietary supplements. But, you know, here's where I hear it hurting industries. Aside from the financial institutions, you get down to companies. I was talking to someone who's a consultant the other day. He said, I work with very large companies who are just going to wait for the FDA to act, and so they're going to sit on the sidelines. Well, that's not good for several reasons. One, for their own financial stability. Two, job creation. Three, large companies potentially have the power to move the needle on not just the legitimacy of these issues, but the quality of products that could be launched, distribution channels, supply chain mechanisms, things that are all laid wide open right now. And then here's where it hurts kind of the worst is research. If companies that have the financial fortitude to be out there and actually move the needle on more science-backed products in these industries for cannabis and CBDs and marijuana, but but the research isn't getting funded, whether it's their own companies or university funding for grants, and they're not getting funded, then research is not getting done. And that's important for this industry because this isn't going away. This is going to continue to evolve. The United States is going to have to kind of catch up with the rest of the world, but it's even affecting, I'll briefly say, intellectual property rights. You can go get patents on CBDs, cannabis, and people have been for 20 plus years, actually 30 plus years, but start working trying to get a trademark on CBDs as a dietary supplement. And they're going to say, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. Because we follow the FDA's, that is still a violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So those are intellectual property rights that are, I would say, not being explored. They're being kind of destroyed because some people already had some of these rights. They're saying, no, we're not going to let these go any further. You can't expand your portfolio. That has a financial disincentive for companies in the space. And I don't think that's helpful. And so you can still do certain things within states for registering trademarks, but a federal trademark is the best thing that you can have. So everywhere you go, there they are. It's kind of the way this looks at it. And so as the states start to continue to do their own things, and I think what is very interesting when you look as to who has what interest in this market, you know, as Bob said, Mitch McConnell very much in favor of hemp, not so much on the other part of the plan on the marijuana side. People would wonder why, but that's an interesting thing that people need to understand as to what each state cares about as an industry, and then also who the people are that are not only legislating or representing them in Congress and at the state legislature, but then also who are the regulatory agencies that this affects. So I think you're going to continue to see a lot of growth in state laws and regulations. I think Illinois is extremely active right now. I know they've got stuff in New Hampshire, Iowa just came out with some stuff. You've got New York, Massachusetts. So these are not small states with small amounts of people. Ironically, some of the smaller states with smaller amounts of people are sometimes having a bigger voice in this discussion. But I think as we move forward, we need some uniformity across the states, because if not, it's like herding cats and spinning plates to try to get all these folks together. We do need some uniformity, and that's going to have to come from the federal level. It would be helpful if it came from the federal level, because it's not going to have uniformity at the state level, and the states are going to have to move forward, because this is such an industry driving for many, many reasons that they're going to have to go and continue to do what they're doing right now. But I think if you start to see the federal, the FDA and Congress step up, which I believe, you know, we've certainly made good progress, and you know, Bob's been in this game a long time and knows this stuff very well. Yes, passage of the Moor Act by the House was a very big symbolic gesture. Moving it through, getting something that turns into a law that gets signed. Yeah, it's going to happen. Will happen under Biden administration? I'll let Mac answer that question. I think people might be surprised as to where he and the vice president kind of stand on those issues. But from the state level, it will continue as it is, with states moving around on their very specific laws for their states. It will remain somewhat confusing, I think, for various sectors of industries. But a lot of my clients are saying, so what do you do here? And then what happens if I sell it there? And, you know, those aren't really, with as much money's already been put into this industry, hopefully those aren't the kind of questions that they have to ask for much longer. So with that, I'll kick it over to Matt.
Kevin, thank you. And thanks to Bob and you both for what I think is a tremendous amount of information that will be helpful to anyone who's interested in how these public policies are going to impact their business operations. And that really is the bottom line. I had the easiest slot on this panel, because a little later, when someone wants to pull up the video of this, the recording, and watch it, and maybe they've had a Jack Daniels to kind of smooth it out, they might hear me say something and they'll say, well, that doesn't make any sense, or that it's completely wrong. But trust me, someone over at the House of Representatives or on the Senate has made their way down to the floor and said exactly what I'm going to say, and it gives me complete credibility. Former Senator Everett Dirksen said it right when he said Congress has the power to do any damn fool thing they want to, and usually does about every 10 seconds. So there's no question that we live in a very interesting time in terms of the way the Congress is approaching some very important issues in this particular space. And the Moor Act is a perfect example of the disconnect and the dysfunction of Congress today. There is no question, as both Bob and Kevin have said, is that it is unlikely that the United States Senate will take up the Moor Act. They just won't, if the current leadership stays in place. And that, of course, is in part going to be determined by what happens down in Georgia. And I say in part because even if there is a split Senate and 50-50, and even if the vice president would then have the ability to break ties, there is a very significant barrier that exists currently under the filibuster rule, which requires that a supermajority pass any of this legislation. If the Democrats had a clear majority where they were in control of the United States Senate, then there is perhaps an opportunity for them to change the Senate rule, which would eliminate that filibuster supermajority rule and make it a majority vote. And then there would be an increased chance that the Moor Act might be considered and actually approved, although even in that scenario, it's not a given, despite the fairly significant majority that it had in the House, including a number of Republicans who joined in on that vote. I think that that's a reflection of the changing landscape in America, of the acceptance of the American people that the current policies regarding marijuana simply don't work. When you look at the criminalization of marijuana and you see the impact that it has on the judicial system and the incarceration rates and the financial burdens that taxpayers have to assume in order to maintain that failed policy, I think there's extreme frustration with that. I think there's growing recognition of the American public that that marijuana may not have the kinds of negative impacts on society that have been articulated in the past, and that's driven largely by new emerging science. You look at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is the arbiter at the federal level of the addiction liability and the adverse impacts. Even Nora Volkow, who is the director of the NIDA, has testified under oath before the House and Senate Appropriations Committees that she does not favor the scheduling of these substances because they impede research. And research is desperately needed in order to have a better understanding of the potential benefits that society can have about substances, including marijuana. So I think that shifting political landscape in the United States is driving many members of Congress who previously would have been in the camp of being absolutely against any action taken on marijuana liberalization and decriminalization, now are taking a second look. And I think that shift will continue to occur no matter what Congress does over the next couple of years, and certainly within the sphere of the 117th Congress. I think that it's instructive to look back at what I call one of the miraculous conversions in the United States Senate, when you had former Senator Orrin Hatch, who represented a very conservative state, who converted from being an ardent opponent to medical marijuana, and then he became a great advocate for it. Once he understood the potential benefits, the science behind it, and the therapeutic values that it had in treating specific classes of patients. I think that's an example of how we can convert people to help them with a better understanding, and you can see that kind of dramatic shift. And I think that opportunity continues to exist. And so as you evaluate what role you can play and how the Natural Products Association, for example, can be your voice up on Capitol Hill, you should be strongly supportive of that effort, because the moving the needle, that we hear that phrase all the time, only occurs if there's constantly a preparation that's done and the groundwork that needs to be undertaken in the halls of Congress is done when you've got an accurate voice that's feeding into the discussions, and one that focuses on the importance that these policy changes will have on the business community, because ultimately it is the businesses who bear the responsibility to fulfill on whatever public policy, so that whatever product is available is one that meets specific standards and that is pure and doesn't have adulterants and contaminants that could potentially lead to adverse events, which ultimately undermine any kind of a product offering that's available. So the public policy is obviously going to be informed by that. The fact that there were more Republicans supporting this decriminalization and other components of the Moor Act, I think is one part of the equation. But when you look at the states that are now passing marijuana initiatives, demonstrating at the ballot box the acceptance by voters that this policy needs to be changed, that decriminalization is a worthy goal, and that we ought to look at the way that we evaluate the availability of marijuana products, even for recreational use. I think is evidence of that shift that is going to occur. And that will have an impact in Washington, D.C. as more of these legislators evaluate the political consequences of being out of the mainstream on these kinds of issues. And obviously, the Moor Act did something that was critically important to introduce into the discussion why the consequences of the use of recreational marijuana has led to all of these adverse outcomes for those that are then pushed through the criminal justice system, both with the criminal records, the denial of benefits that they are not allowed to have under the law because of their convictions. That has impacts on the voting public. And even though the population of those that are directly impacted may be smaller than a critical mass that's needed for movement on these public policy issues, the fact that their families and other people who are sympathetic to the overreach of the government in these areas leads to a very large population that I think is having a significant impact going forward as we reevaluate the federal policy on marijuana. Many people are heartened by the fact that potentially, with the very strong support that the Vice President-elect Kamala Harris has on the Moor Act, that might lead to some kind of movement in the Senate. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Even if she were to preside over the Senate, she is but one vote, and the decision-making about what gets to the floor really goes through a sieve. We know, and Kevin referenced it, that Mitch McConnell, no matter what his caucus thinks, ultimately has the ability to control the agenda on the floor of the United States Senate. So if he personally chooses not to allow for the Moor Act to even be brought up, it will not be brought up. It would take an enormous amount of pressure from his colleagues, and currently we don't have that critical mass within the Republican caucus to push the majority leader to do something like that. But even in a split Senate, where you would have the vice president there, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference, particularly since we have the filibuster rule that will get in the way of that. But the fact that she is an advocate and the fact that the Biden administration has a broader issue that they have to deal with, and that is, what can they do to satisfy the progressives in the Democratic Party to give them something in order to calm them down about some of the other things that the Biden administration has not been comfortable in giving on that agenda. The Democratic Party platform is obviously very good for the marijuana industry, but that is not going to translate into policies that are established and that are actually executed in the Biden administration, given the current lay of the land as to cabinet appointments. We don't see great advocates there, and the progressives are upset about this. So the fact that there has to be some sort of concession made to them opens the avenue for us to have discussions that we would be a part of that give and take on with the progressives about what the Biden administration is willing to push. Now, frankly, the Democrats that are going to be involved in those transactions are glad to say, hey, we'll do that, knowing that a Republican Senate, or at least the inability of the 60 vote rule, the filibuster rule, they won't be able to get anything done. They can blame the Republicans for not doing it, but that will at least attract attention, give more energy to this issue, and I think overall it will be great for us. The other thing that is a little bit troublesome is how the revenue from the legalization of marijuana would be handled and how it is captured. The Moor Act provides for the creation of some funds that would allow for the revenues from the marijuana sales to go into a variety of social justice funds and benefits and causes. That's not going to be well favored by many of the states and the state and local governments, because they have their own needs and they want to invoke their own constitutional federalism rights to make decisions about how revenues are handled. And the fact that it may play well in Washington to create those funds, it really doesn't speak to what the support that would be required for these kinds of actions. So that's a troublesome issue, I think, for the marijuana lobby to deal with in terms of getting the final product out the door at some point in the future. Again, with some lead time in order to get that done, not likely to happen in the near term. The fact that the act addresses things like loans for small businesses in cannabis, that's a great step forward, but then they add in that poison pill that says that they would give emphasis to and priority for social equity candidates. And of course, that's the kind of debate that appropriately needs to be done about access for minority groups to be able to create businesses, but here to use this particular bill as a mechanism for stimulating that kind of thing might not be favored and would create more resistance among the Republicans, not because they may not be for the decriminalization, but the actual devil being in the details that creates real problems for them. The current passage of the Moor Act in the House does send a very strong message to the Biden administration that members of the House are very serious about legalizing cannabis. And it does indeed put more pressure on both the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Food and Drug Administration, because they know that they're going to be at the point of any policy implementation that is made by the Biden administration. And I think that you're going to see a change in the regulatory platform that they use in order to deal with these kinds of issues. It will not impact the embedded bias that is held by the career staff at the FDA and the DEA, because that's the deep state that everyone likes to talk about. They're real, and they will push back against any policy change by the Biden administration that they don't particularly favor. And it is an unknown at this point as to what the deep state views might be on these kinds of issues. But we know that the FDA is very protective of their policy portfolio and tend to want to have more regulatory control rather than less. And of course, I mentioned earlier, the outlier here is that NIDA has been very supportive of the research pathway, and I think that bodes well for what we're trying to do in terms of decriminalizing, descheduling, and getting marijuana in the right legislative position. The implications that this has on other legislative and regulatory hurdles with respect to dietary ingredients and food additives is simply this: it opens the discussion on Capitol Hill for the number of unreasonable FDA positions that have been taken. And I think that's a positive outcome of this discussion. The fact that the House of Representatives has recognized clearly that the current position that's held by the federal government is simply wrong, and that there has to be a wider discussion. And I think we slip into the door being able to have those kinds of discussions about the FDA's in some cases, absurd position on dietary ingredients and food additives. And I think that we can become a part of a regulatory reform effort that would impact the power that the FDA has to act with impunity in some of these areas. There also is clearly more discussion now about the regulatory pathway for consumable hemp products. And will that be the next step? I think it's possible. McConnell's position on the marijuana has been very disappointing. Understand that his support for the descheduling of hemp with a THC content of 0.3% or less was always about the farmers in his home state. He was very upset with what happened with the hemp processors and the issues that arose with respect to bankruptcies that occurred within that industry, where the farmers were disadvantaged economically and in terms of having a capacity for the processing of their crops. And what he believes is a corrupt kind of industry, which McConnell has been saying is just the nature of the industry because of marijuana. And the truth is, it's the nature of business where you get people having too much autonomy with too much money, and they tend to abuse their positions. It has nothing to do with whether it was marijuana or not. But we do know that now this issue is on the table now that the House has passed it, and there is an opportunity for a trade on some other issues. Whenever these kinds of issues get into the commerce of the legislature, where someone wants something, they say, well, if I give you this, and they start to trade, all of the piggies will be at the trough. Every one of them trying to take advantage of those opportunities to get in on those trades. And that's why it's so important that the Natural Products Association is the calm voice that talks about good public policy and doesn't try to exploit it the way for economic gain, the way that these others, I call them piggies because that's what they are. They're always out there trying their best to undermine good public policy in order to get their own economic advantage. Obviously, that if we can do this, if the Moor Act were enacted, or if a version of it were eventually to be implemented, we would effectively end many of the obstacles that have been created by the current posture on cannabis as being illegal. That includes things like access to banking, the tax consequences of the onerous 280E provision, the immigration impacts and the threats of federal criminal enforcement on populations, particularly minority populations, that tend to be more targeted in those situations. All of those things are going to make a dramatic difference as we evaluate how we handle this issue, talk about it, make it a part of the discussions, and capitalize on what the House did with the Moor Act. There will be more and more support that's generated over time. And as disappointing as it may be that the current political landscape doesn't look like it will allow for a fair prosecution of the Moor Act, we just have to understand that over time, we're going to be able to move the needle. I'm always reminded of what Barry Goldwater said when he was first elected to the United States Senate. And he participated in a particularly aggressive and passionate debate on the floor of the United States Senate in which he had lost. But he said he sat there after the floor had cleared, and he sat in the well of the United States Senate, and he looked around and observed the majesty of that room, the history behind it, and the fact that so many of these debates that had impacted public policy for decades, that he was there, and he said he wondered, how in the world did I ever get here? And he said it was just a short 6 months later when he was involved in a similar battle on the floor of the Senate with equal passion, with a same disappointing result. And he said he sat there on the floor of the Senate and he looked around and he said, how the hell did they get here? And that's sort of where we are in the Congress. These are different personalities. They bring to the table different experiences, but all are influenced by two things. One is the will of their constituents. They can only ignore it for so long. And we're seeing now this shift in the views of the American public about marijuana and its legalization and a reasonable policy framework to deal with it. And the second thing we're seeing is that we have an opportunity at the Natural Products Association to be that voice of reason, to talk about how there can be a public policy framework enacted that will protect against the downsides that everyone recognizes that potentially are there, and yet opens the door for a reasonable policy, and particularly starts to look closely at things like CBD and other hemp consumables and marijuana products that can be reasonably marketed in the marketplace. That's our goal, and I recommend that everyone put their time and their money behind this effort, because it makes a difference. As I said, it moves the needle, and it will have a dramatic impact on how your businesses are going to be impacted in the future. So with that, I'll turn it back to Dan and to Kyle, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Mac, Bob, Kevin, really appreciate it. We have some questions, so Kyle's going to go ahead and lead us that way.
I appreciate it, guys. And for those that are on the webinar, feel free to use the chat box to ask some questions. Just leading off for the three of you, what do you guys see happening in the next 12 to 18 months with not only the Moor Act and cannabis reform, but also CBD and that inclusion of as a dietary ingredient?
I'll take a stab at that one first, Kyle. At the end of the day, what we've seen in the European Union is indicative of, what I think we'll see in the United States. We've seen the European Union basically flip-flop on moving forward as a novel food ingredient or a new dietary ingredient, using our parlance here in the United States, to saying, no, we're going to treat non-intoxicating cannabinoids like CBD as a narcotic. Then a European Court of Justice opinion came out in the last 3 weeks that said, no, if a member country in the European Union has legalized the plant and its derivatives, then it's legal throughout the European Union, effectively prohibiting and eliminating barriers. And that doesn't create the regulatory side of the process. It's the exact same thing. We have this regulatory void. I've written an article in Forbes about this, calling it regulatory chaos. How can you begin to operate and supply material on a global scale, which is really what this is right now, without some sort of common denominator for regulation? So what I predict going into 2021 is how strongly does the FDA come out? And you all have been dealing with the FDA for decades and decades, and we understand largely how it works, or maybe more properly how it doesn't work. Does the FDA take its enforcement position, gather all of the safety data that it's out there seeking right now through its RFP process that was awarded back in October? And then does it create a regulatory pathway for that that's distinct from the existing pathways? Does it jam the pathway down our throats? Does it look at what the European Union does, or even the United Kingdom or Ireland, for example, which have put forth progressive pathways to regulation over these products and materials? But at the end of the day, 2021 on the industrial hemp side, as far as those derivatives go, we'll see FDA movement, if not inconsistent policy advice and continued meddling by the DEA. On the marijuana side of the industry, because of this signal surrounding the Moor Act, as Kevin noted, it moves the needle. It is going to continue to have more and more people invest in that industry, aggregating distressed or underperforming assets across the United States, from dispensaries to cultivation facilities and extraction outlets, and aggregating those and positioning themselves for a quote unquote post-prohibitionist operating environment. And I would agree that we're not likely to see outright legalization at the federal level, but I would also argue that it's not particularly necessary, because everything that marijuana can do, hemp can do on a much greater scale, because it's an agricultural commodity, an agricultural crop, not something that's simply grown in greenhouses under strictly controlled conditions. And more importantly, as we see this move forward, you have to create an industry state by state by state when you speak about marijuana. That may not be efficient as, for example, creating a cultivation facility in the middle of the country for distribution all over. But what it does, and I think Kevin and Mac both commented on this, that creates more jobs. The inefficiencies surrounding the regulatory environment and the legal environment on marijuana creates more jobs. More jobs means more people pay their income taxes and support their families with income from this industry. That is what continues to ingrain and create a foundation for legalized marijuana in the United States. Yes, people legalize marijuana or legalize cannabis for different reasons, whether that's jobs, as an economic driver, medicinal, social impact, or research, or a combination of all of the above. But in the United States, those two things will certainly come to fruition in 2021 because we're going to need it. We're going to need it because we still don't understand the devastating impacts that these shutdowns will have and continue to have on our economy going forward after that makeup we've had over the last 3 months for increased economic improvement across the U.S. So I believe this, as an economic driver, will cause those two things on the hemp and the marijuana side of the industry to accelerate.
Yeah. So I'll follow up on Bob's comments with respect to the regulatory pathway with the FDA. Yeah, we do need the FDA to step in and do something, and they'll tell you, well, there's something sitting over at the White House. We've kind of given our thoughts to OMB, and they're there. And I have a feeling when we see those, that those of us who work in this industry a lot and can read between the lines of a federal agency giving another document to another federal agency, it's going to feel a lot like the report to Congress in February. It's 15 pages of a lot of nothing. We've tested 200 products. Hey, we're going to go buy another 500 and go look at those because it took us this long to look at 200. With respect to, but without the FDA doing something, I think the FDA will do something in 2020 that will make itself feel like the equivalent of a regulatory hug to industry. But not so much to industry, because it's not going to give them enough guidance. It's not going to give them enough. It's not going to give all of the ancillary services and service providers that work with them enough clarity in this area to say, okay, I can go all in and I don't have to worry about my regulatory body that's outside the FDA that watches over me. So, the FDA is really, the Moor Act helps push this process forward with the FDA, because it pushes the issue of the FDA saying you have to do something about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so it pushes them. But the FDA has been very, I think, out in the open about how much they're not going to be pushed to expedite things for CBDs, because this is not the first year we've been talking about this. And if CBDs do go down the new dietary ingredient notification process, when we get to enforcement, I'll be interested to see what the FDA says they'll do, and then will do, because they certainly have the ability to do things. Whether they'll do it, and that might be what's holding them back in large part, is once they do this, they may actually have to back it up and enforce something. And if their argument is, we first have to figure out, look, they do need to figure out what the right daily intake amount is. The question is do they have that information already? So, their question is, well, it's the damage that could be done if we take action. And I think Bob and Mac and I've talked about the damage that's being done by not taking action by the FDA. And that's getting significant. So in 2021, I don't think you're going to see passage of the Moor Act to the Senate, as I think Mac took the biggest whack at. I think, but I think you're going to see movement. I think you'll see movement under this administration, because I don't think Biden is, he's more of a moderate on this issue. I think you're going to have something equivalent to what they call the Cole letter that came out of the Obama administration about federal resources at DOJ not spending their time chasing around the criminalization of marijuana-related incidences. I think he's looking for criminal justice reform and decriminalization. I think the vice president could be the person who pushes more on this issue. She's certainly the sponsor of this bill in the on the Senate side. But I mean, it has impacts across several industries. It affects the bank. It affects banking regulations. What do they do? It does have a cascading effect, and it is interesting to see how much role that the FDA is having in this as we look to an agency of importance for some, not just guidance, but some, more importantly, action.
So I would add to that if there's one thing that's true about Washington, D.C., if there's a vacuum, some bureaucrat will jump in and suck up all the space. And that is exactly what the FDA has done whenever the Congress passes legislation that grants to the FDA, in good faith, this scientific review of anything, because Congress is loath to try to step on the scientists. The FDA exploits that to the hilt. And instead of giving us policies that are driven by science, it's driven by philosophy, and very little science gets into it. And so I think our challenge is to convince the Congress that they have to take a more active and expansive role in shrinking the limits in which the FDA can operate on policy issues, including narrowing the input that they have and the way that they express the input on scientific issues. Because we know that the biases of the FDA with respect to natural substances and natural products are legion. We've known that they hated the DSHEA Act from day one. And if it were up to the FDA today, they would repeal it. And yet it is the single legislative vehicle that's responsible for hundreds of thousands of jobs in America, $53 billion in economic input, and the FDA would squash it out of existence today if they had the power to do it. The Congress needs to understand that by granting these expansive powers to the FDA, they are handing them the weapon that destroys jobs, undermines our economy, and strips consumers of the free access to make informed decisions about their health and well-being. And they strangle businesses along the way. We have got to educate the Congress that this is ended. The one buffer we had, the one particular advantage we had when Senator Orrin Hatch was there and before he retired, was that the FDA had to come and at least talk to him and clear some of their more onerous regulations. And a lot of those got stopped. Now there is no blockade. the FDA acts almost with impunity. And so we've got to restore that balance. You find a champion. I know that NPA members are going to be very excited to learn that the NPA is ready to embark on that very issue with a champion that will fill that void. But we've got to get others engaged too. And without it, we're going to continue to have these struggles and fights. Great for lobbyists, by the way, but terrible for consumers, terrible for the industry. And we simply got to rebalance that equation up on Capitol Hill.
That's great. Thank you for this. Let's review with that analysis. Looking at CBD and kind of the inaction that the FDA has taken on, not setting a safe level of daily consumption, not inspecting facilities or testing products. You know, let's say we're looking 2 years down the line and the Moor Act is finally passed regulating cannabis. Do you foresee some of the frustrations that we've had with CBD on THC products, specifically as a dietary ingredient or food additive?
I mean, you got to think about the fact that you're all of a sudden putting intoxicating components into those plants as a regular matter. How does that get regulated by the FDA? When you look at equivalent scenarios, whether that's the alcohol industry, the tobacco industry, industries where they genuinely put products into the marketplace to cause some sort of intoxicating impact, at least of some sort, or potentially addictive impact, those are regulated far more stringently. Does a high THC product get regulated as a baseline ingredient by the FDA? I mean, certainly as a foundational piece from production, manufacturing, and standardization, but as a regular matter, I'm not sure that the FDA is equipped for that. And that's why I say, even if the Moor Act were to pass or something like that, or there were federal legalization, we have a problem where there is no uniformity about how those products will be treated in the marketplace. And there doesn't appear to be any solution to that anytime soon. We're struggling for years and will continue to struggle for years to regulate non-intoxicating parts of the plant. I don't think you can just start putting high THC ingredients into the marketplace and expect the FDA or the state equivalents to oversee that in interstate commerce. We have seen very tight controls on a state-by-state basis over the regulated dispensary system, for lack of a better way to put it, but that's because it's a very narrow set. There's no interstate commerce involved. But when you start to put this into international commerce, and I'm not just talking about products for export only, which is an easy first step, by the way, I would note. If the United States wanted to do that, they can follow the model that we've seen in many of the Latin American countries and say, let's create and allow these products for export only, and then later on create the domestic marketplace on a federal level versus just allowing the states to do what they want. And one last note on that is that does appear to be the Biden administration's policy perspective on this, is they want to decriminalize, but they also want to put it up to the states to enact regulations. And hopefully there will come along with it some clarity that the operators in this space, the investors in this space, the mothers and the fathers and the family members that earn money from this space, that they're no longer criminals for operating in an industry that is a Schedule I substance.
You know, Kyle, you've kind of hit on the right question as far as dietary ingredients and dietary supplements, and specifically, I'll just say as it relates to CBDs, because in the next year or two, will the FDA give enough clarity around this, or will we have enough clarity overall around this? And I think the FDA, again, as everyone has said here, and I think, Mac, that was an outstanding way you described the power that the FDA has been anointed by coincidence, design, or mistake at this point, as it affects this as it affects this industry. Because I can tell you, it's going to end up being, I think, that the FDA is going to continue to come out with things. I call them placeholders, where they recognize and understand and show some form of regulatory empathy for industry as to what they're going through, and they know that's tough and they're working on it. And then you'll get another one where they're feeling empathy and they're still working on it, and they're going to release something that says, but further work's going to be needed and we feel bad for you and we're working on it. That isn't helpful for this industry. And so I think what I see, and I'm sure Bob and Mac, and I know Dan and Kyle certainly see it, is it's organizations like MPA and it's outside counsel who are really advising companies as to a risk matrix, because that's really what companies are living through right now is, where do I assign my risk? How much am I willing to take? Am I going to do it within a state, nationally, internationally, to Bob's point, exports or only? And to watch the United States, I don't really use a lot of marijuana jokes because I take this stuff pretty seriously, but getting smoked by the rest of the world on progress on something that has been before Congress for so long, before the FDA for quite a while, it reaches a point of being disingenuous by the agency to move this stuff forward. Focus on it is significant. I believe it was probably overwhelming at one point, but they have, I believe, the ability to do this and should do it. And they can certainly provide more guidance, and they can certainly reduce risk. Do I see everything we need getting done in the next? And I'll take out the non marijuana component. Let Bob comment on that and just stick to the more like the hemp related CBDs. I mean, I have people ask me questions about what happens if the extract I'm using or something or whatever it's doing as a dry weight, if it's 0.5% in a raw ingredient or before it gets through final processing, gets down below 0.03, right? Is that a problem? Was I breaking the law through half of the manufacturing process, but ended up with, a product that, at least in where I'm using it or selling it, is legal? I mean, these questions get very granular when companies are asking this, and they're looking at a grid of risk. Do I support this? Do I not support this? It defines who they work with. Look, there are going to be a lot of companies in this industry that when the FDA does come out with appropriate regulatory oversight, will probably fade to black and will go away. And I think we've all seen more of the cream rising to the top. People, this industry has become, I think, much more legitimized. The stigma has gone down, but it's not gone. But you're seeing real innovation, real companies getting involved in this. For a lot of people just be held up, well, some aren't being held up. I mean, this stuff's everywhere. But it all comes with risk. So I don't know that you'll see enough movement in the next year at 12 to 18 months. But I do agree with Mac that where it's being held up the worst is by the FDA.
And I think, just as an example, is the CBD battle that's ongoing now. The FDA uses fear in order to push through their completely unjustified policies. And CBD is the perfect example of it. When they are asked the question about what is the safe daily dose level for a consumer, they say, we don't know. And yet there is ample evidence that's available at the WHO, and other studies have been done that absolutely gives them the parameters that are needed in order to enact a good CBD policy for consumer products. And yet they ignore that, and they use that shield. They say, oh, we need more studies. We always need more studies on every product, including new drug applications. That's why they have a post-approval monitoring system in place in order to continue to gather information about the safety and efficacy of those products. They could do that same model with CBD. They could set a safe daily level of a CBD product and allow those products to be marketed, and then tweak it if necessary based on post-approval monitoring systems. They refuse to do it because they are biased against CBD. You look at what Commissioner Hahn did in February of 2020, 10 months ago. He stood before the State Agriculture Commission's Commissioners Conference in Washington, D.C., recounted how, and this was off script, by the way, recounted how he had walked off the plane at Reagan National Airport, walked down the concourse, and the first thing he saw was a huge display of CBD products. He recounted to them, these products are illegal, and here they're being sold in our nation's capital. He said, how is that? And then he said the most important thing that any FDA commissioner could say. He said, it would be a fool's errand for us to try, meaning the FDA, to try to regulate the consumption and purchasing of CBD products by the American public, because that's happening. It is every state in the union allows these products to be sold. Better for us to inform the public, to give them reasonable guidelines. He obviously left that conference in February of 2020, went back out to the FDA, and he has hidden in the bunker since, because there have been no pronouncements about what we're doing. They have one hidden policy that they gave to OMB, no disclosures about it, and yet they continue this attack on the CBD industry. This is what the FDA does. In order to get their way, they will simply instill fear in the American public. They'll instill fear down on Capitol Hill and say we don't have enough research. That is true for every substance that they currently have under their review, and for most of those that they have approved. That should not be the barrier to consumers being able to have safe access, because guess what? Without it, you see a marketplace that is being riddled with adulteration of CBD products. Some CBD products don't even have CBD in them. Some have too much, some poorly quantified or manufactured, and the purity levels are all over the map. That's the danger to the American public. And yet the FDA is the instigator of that policy by their inaction. We've simply got to turn the corner and start to look at the FDA for what its role should be, not giving them the ultimate power to be the ones to say yay or nay to every single substance because they have a bias against it. So I'll stop my rant.
Guys, that was wonderful. Bob, Kevin, Mac, can't thank you guys enough. Kyle, as always, thank you. We definitely need to do this again. We're out of time today, but if folks have any questions, feel free to email them in, get them to the speakers, and really great information, very timely, very insightful. And like I said, we'll definitely look at getting the three of you together again. So this was really well done. So thank you guys. Have a great rest of your day, and stay tuned to www.npanational.org for more updates on CBD and all things natural. Thank you guys.
Thank you.